You are 8 years old, and you wake up not to the familiar warmth of your mother's hand, but to the chilling clang of a distant bell. This is the Convent of Saint Isolde, your new home, your gilded cage. The promise of play, a whispered memory of sunshine and laughter, has evaporated like morning mist on the cold stone floors. Here, childish games are sins of indulgence, and the only thing that truly begins is the slow, methodical education in pain, cloaked in the sacred language of penance. You have been given away, a daughter deemed superfluous, a soul to be bartered for heavenly favor. The journey here was a blur of rumbling carriage wheels and the solemn, determined face of your father, a man who saw this transaction not as abandonment, but as an act of profound piety. You remember the towering gates of the convent, wrought iron twisted into grimacing seraphim, closing behind you with a sound of crushing finality. For the first few days, the convent presented a facade of serene, ethereal beauty. The air smelled of beeswax and incense, sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, painting the stone walls in hues of sapphire and blood, and the nuns glided like silent, white-robed ghosts, their voices a hypnotic, melodic chant that seemed to promise peace. But this was a peace not meant for the living, vibrant heart of a child. It was the sterile, oppressive quiet of a mausoleum. You were stripped of your fine clothes, the soft velvet and intricate embroidery replaced with a coarse, undyed woolen habit that scratched at your skin, a constant, irritating reminder of your new station. They took your name, the one your mother sang to you in lullabies, and gave you a new one, Agnes, a name that felt like a cloak woven from someone else's sorrow. This place, you slowly began to understand, was not a sanctuary but a crucible, designed to burn away the very essence of who you were, to melt you down and recast you into a shape deemed worthy of God, a shape that felt alien to your own bones. The initial fear, a sharp and piercing thing, slowly subsided into a dull, hollow dread that settled in your stomach like a stone. You watched the other girls, the other oblates, their faces pale and serious, their movements measured and devoid of the spontaneous joy that should define childhood. Their eyes held a haunted, knowing look that you would come to recognize as the reflection of your own encroaching despair. The struggle to maintain a sense of self, to hold on to the fading memory of a life before these walls, had begun, a silent, internal war waged against the overwhelming force of the system you were now trapped within. The ceremony of your oblation was a masterpiece of psychological theater, a public spectacle designed to formalize your erasure. You were led into the chapel, the air thick with the scent of melting wax and the unblinking gaze of countless statues whose painted eyes seemed to follow your every trembling step. Dressed in a miniature bridal gown, you were presented at the altar as a sponsa Christi, a bride of Christ. The bishop, his voice a resonant boom that filled the cavernous space, spoke of sacred duty and eternal reward, his words weaving a tapestry of divine purpose around the stark reality of a child being irrevocably signed away. Your father stood beside you, his expression a mask of solemn pride, as he placed your small hand upon the altar, formally renouncing his paternal rights and commending you to the perpetual service of God. You were too young to grasp the legal or theological finality of the act, but you understood the language of ownership. You felt the weight of their collective will pressing down on you, a force as tangible and inescapable as the cold stone beneath your knees. After the vows were spoken for you, you were taken to a small antechamber where the abbess herself, a figure of remote and terrifying authority, presided over your transformation. The bridal gown was cut from your body, the scissors cold and sharp against your skin, and the rough habit of a novice was pulled over your head. Then came the shearing of your hair, the long braids your mother had so lovingly tended falling to the floor in lifeless coils. Each snip of the shears was a severance, a cutting away of your past, your identity, your connection to the world outside. You were no longer Ilara, daughter of the Baron de Courcy. You were Agnes, a nameless, faceless servant of the convent, your life no longer your own. The other nuns watched, their expressions impassive, their complicity a silent testament to the system they served. A system that demanded the sacrifice of childhood on the altar of institutional piety. Your fate, you realized with a chilling certainty that belied your years, was now tragic and absolute. The architect of this meticulously ordered suffering was the abbess, Mother Hildegard, a woman whose piety had metastasized into a form of psychological psychosis. She was a tall, gaunt figure, her face a mask of pale parchment stretched taut over sharp, unforgiving bones. Her eyes, the color of chips of ice, seemed to see not the person before her, but the myriad sins and failings hidden within their soul. She moved with a preternatural stillness, her presence sucking the warmth and air from any room she entered. Her backstory was a thing of whispered, fearful speculation among the novices. Some said she was the spurned daughter of a duke, her worldly ambitions curdled by disappointment and redirected with ferocious intensity toward the acquisition of spiritual power. Others whispered that a tragic, illicit love affair had shattered her youth, leaving behind a heart so thoroughly broken that it could no longer feel empathy, only a burning need to impose order on a chaotic world. Whatever the cause, her deep-seated personal flaws had manifested as a regime of public cruelty and catastrophic misrule. Her obsession was with perfection, an impossible, inhuman standard of devotion that she enforced with a perverted ingenuity. She saw childhood not as a state of innocence to be nurtured but as a wilderness of untamed passions to be ruthlessly cleared and cultivated. Play was idleness, laughter was frivolity, and any emotional bond between the girls was a particular friendship, a sin she hunted with the obsessive zeal of an inquisitor. Her paranoia drove the narrative of daily life within the convent. She believed laxity was the devil's foothold, and so she constructed a world of such rigid, unyielding structure that it left no space for the human spirit to breathe. She would appear silently in doorways, her gaze sweeping over the scriptorium or the weaving room, searching for a slouched shoulder, a whispered word, a moment of straying attention. The discovery of such an infraction would unleash a torrent of cold, carefully articulated condemnation, a verbal flaying that was often more painful than any physical punishment. She was the dysfunctional tyrant at the heart of this world, an all-powerful figure whose internal torment was projected outward, shaping the convent into a reflection of her own damaged soul. The days bled into one another, a monotonous, rhythmic cycle of prayer and labor governed by the tolling of the canonical bells. Before the sun had even risen, you were roused from your thin straw mattress by the clanging summons to matins, your small feet bare against the frigid stone floors as you shuffled, half asleep, to the chapel. The hours were a blur of Latin chants you did not understand, the words washing over you as a meaningless, hypnotic drone. Your knees ached from the endless kneeling, your stomach growled with a persistent, gnawing hunger, and your mind, starved of stimulation, began to feel as gray and featureless as the convent walls. The work was grueling and repetitive. You spent hours in the scriptorium, your small, clumsy fingers struggling to copy intricate manuscripts, the threat of the choirmistress's rod a constant presence over your shoulder. A splotch of ink, a poorly formed letter, would result in a sharp rap across the knuckles, a sting of pain that was meant to be a lesson in diligence. You labored in the convent gardens, pulling weeds under the hot sun, your back screaming in protest. You worked in the kitchens, peeling endless piles of vegetables, the meager rations a constant reminder of your lowly status. Silence was the supreme rule, a heavy, suffocating blanket that smothered all impulse for communication. To speak without permission was a grave offense, and so you learned to live inside your own head, your thoughts your only companions. The systematic erasure of your childhood was relentless. There were no toys, no games, no stories other than the hagiographies of saints whose lives of extreme suffering were presented as the ultimate ideal. The complicit system enforcers, the older nuns who had long ago surrendered their own individuality, were the instruments of this erasure. Sister Agnes, the mistress of novices, was particularly adept at this. Her face was a permanent mask of disapproval, her eyes missing no infraction. She policed your posture, your gaze, your every gesture, her presence, a constant source of low-grade terror. Yet, sometimes, in a fleeting, unguarded moment, you would see a flicker of something in her eye spitty, regret. Before it was swiftly extinguished, her features hardening once more into the familiar mask of stern authority. She, too, was a victim of the system, her humanity compromised and desensitized by years of acting out of fear and a twisted sense of duty. In this desolate landscape of enforced conformity, the smallest act of rebellion, the most fleeting moment of shared humanity, felt like a radical transgression. It happened during one of the rare periods of recreation, a supervised hour in the cloister garden where you were permitted to walk in silent, single file. The air was thick with the scent of rain-soaked earth and blooming roses, a fragrance that stirred a painful longing for a life you could barely remember. You were walking behind a girl named Isabel, a pale, quiet child who had arrived a few months after you. As you rounded a corner, hidden for a brief moment from the watchful eye of the supervising nun, Isabel stooped and picked up a small, smooth, white stone. She glanced back at you, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement, and with a furtive movement, pressed the cool stone into your palm. It was nothing, a simple pebble, but in that moment it felt like a treasure of immense value. It was a secret, a shared connection, a tiny spark of defiance in a world that demanded total submission. For days, the stone was your most precious possession. You kept it hidden in a loose seam of your mattress, taking it out only in the dead of night to feel its comforting smoothness against your cheek. You and Isabel would exchange fleeting, secret smiles across the chapel, the shared knowledge of the stone, a silent bond between you. It was a foolish, childish game, but it was yours. The discovery, when it came, was brutal and swift. A routine inspection of the dormitory, led by the abbess herself, unearthed your pathetic treasure. Mother Hildegard held the small stone in her palm as if it were a venomous serpent, her face a mask of cold fury. She did not raise her voice. Her condemnation was delivered in a low, chilling whisper that was far more terrifying than any shout. She spoke of vanity, of earthly attachments, of the sin of particular friendship that distracted the soul from its devotion to God. You and Isabel were forced to stand before the entire community in the chapter house, the object of your crime displayed for all to see. The punishment was designed for maximum humiliation. You were both sentenced to a week of bread and water, but that was the least of it. You were made to wear a sign around your neck that read "idolatrous," and were forbidden to speak to or even look at one another. The cruelest part of the punishment was being forced to kneel on opposite sides of the chapel during the long hours of prayer, so close and yet so utterly, devastatingly separate. The playful impulse had been discovered, and the pain that followed was swift, efficient, and designed to ensure such a transgression would never happen again. Hunger was a constant, intimate companion within the convent walls, a tool of control as powerful as any rod or lecture. The official reason for the meager diet was spiritual. The mortification of the flesh was believed to elevate the soul, to starve the sinful appetites and bring one closer to God. But you, with the simple, unclouded logic of a child, knew that the convent was not poor. You saw the lavish vestments of the priests on feast days, the gleaming gold of the chalice on the altar, the fine horses in the stables that belonged to the abbess. You smelled the rich, savory aromas of roasting meat wafting from Mother Hildegard's private kitchen, a scent that was a form of torture in itself. The disparity between the institution's wealth and the gnawing emptiness in your belly was a silent, daily lesson in hierarchy and power. Breakfast was a single piece of coarse, dark bread, often stale, and a cup of watered-down ale. The midday meal was a thin, greasy vegetable pottage, sometimes with a few stringy pieces of unidentifiable meat, a dish that did little to satisfy the deep, aching hunger. Supper was often nothing more than the leftovers from the midday meal, colder and even less palatable. On fast days, which were frequent, it was only bread and water. The effect of this systematic deprivation was profound. It created a constant, low-level misery that sapped your strength and made it difficult to concentrate on your lessons or your prayers. It fostered a desperate, animalistic focus on food. You would find yourself fantasizing about the feasts your family used to have, your mind conjuring up the taste of roast chicken or the sweetness of a honey cake with an almost hallucinatory clarity. This constant gnawing want was a physical manifestation of your emotional and spiritual starvation. It made the girls weak, not just in body, but in spirit, rendering them more docile, more compliant, less likely to possess the energy or the will to rebel. It was a form of systematic cruelty, cloaked in the guise of piety, a perverted means of control that kept the convent's youngest and most vulnerable inhabitants in a state of perpetual want and submission. The hollow dread that had settled in your stomach on your first day had found a physical counterpart in the unending ache of hunger. Sickness, in the claustrophobic world of Saint Isolde's, was not merely a matter of the body, it was a profound spiritual and moral crisis. When a child's body succumbed to fever or infection, it was viewed not with compassion, but with suspicion. Illness was seen as a physical manifestation of a spiritual impurity, a sign that the devil had found a weakness in the soul's defenses. The remedies, therefore, were as much about exorcising sin as they were about healing the flesh, and they were often brutal. The convent's infirmary, Sister Benedicta, was a woman whose ignorance was matched only by her certainty. She operated according to the ancient, flawed wisdom of humoral theory, believing all sickness stemmed from an imbalance of the four essential fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Her cures were a terrifying catalogue of medieval medical barbarism. For a simple fever, the first course of action was always bloodletting. You would be held down, your arm tightly bound, as Sister Benedicta, with a grim and practiced air, made an incision with her lancet, the bright red blood spilling into a bowl, your life force draining away in the name of restoring balance. Can you imagine the psychological torture of being taught that your own body's pain was a sign of your wickedness? That the cure required a violent, terrifying penance? For coughs and lung ailments, she would force you to swallow foul, tasting concoctions of herbs, some of which were harmless, others potent purgatives that left you weak and writhing with cramps. Poultices made of stinging nettles or mustard were applied to the skin to draw out the evil humors, raising painful blisters that often became infected, creating a new sickness in place of the old. There was no gentleness, no comfort. You were a vessel of corruption to be scoured clean. Sister Benedicta, like the other nuns, was a complicit system enforcer, her actions born not of malice, but of a desensitized acceptance of the convent's twisted logic. She saw herself as a soldier in a spiritual war, and the sick children were the battleground. The suffering she inflicted was, in her mind, a necessary violence, a way of purifying a soul in peril. For the children trapped in her care, it was a waking nightmare, a world where pain was medicine and compassion was a heresy. The most insidious form of cruelty practiced within the convent was the systematic dismantling of human connection. Friendships, the natural, life-sustaining bonds that children instinctively form, were viewed with the deepest suspicion. They were labeled particular friendships, a term dripping with sinister implication, suggesting a love that was exclusive, secretive, and therefore a threat to the all-encompassing, communal love that was meant to be directed solely towards God. In reality, it was a mechanism of control. The abbess understood that where there was solidarity, there was the potential for dissent. Isolated, lonely individuals are far easier to dominate than a group united by affection and loyalty. And so, a war was waged against friendship. You were forbidden from having a favorite companion. To be seen whispering with the same girl too often was to invite interrogation and punishment. You learned to communicate in fleeting glances, in coded gestures, in the silent exchange of a shared look of despair during a particularly long sermon. But even these small connections were fraught with peril. The walls had ears. The system encouraged informing. Girls were rewarded with small favoursome extra piece of bread, a reprieve from a hated chore for reporting on the particular friendships of others. This fostered an atmosphere of pervasive conspiratorial mistrust that was poison to the soul. You never knew who might betray you, who might twist an innocent word or gesture into a sinful conspiracy. You became a ghost haunting your own life, your internal world, a fortress where you hoarded the fading memories of your family, of your old life. You would trace the face of your mother in your mind's eye, trying desperately to recall the sound of her voice, the feeling of her hand in yours. But the memories were becoming thin, translucent, like old tapestries worn bare with time. The convent was designed to make you forget, to replace the love of a mother and a father with the abstract, terrifying love of a distant, demanding God. It was a process of profound dehumanization, a struggle to maintain your own sense of self against the overwhelming, crushing force of the institution. You were being hollowed out, emptied of all personal feeling, so that you could be filled with the doctrines and duties of your new life. The psychological architecture of the convent was as formidable and oppressive as its stone walls. The primary tool of control was the cultivation of a deep and abiding sense of guilt. Every natural impulse of childhood, the desire to run, to shout, to laugh, to question, was reframed as a sin, a failing, a stain upon your immortal soul. This was reinforced through the ritual of public confession. Once a week, the entire community would gather in the chapter house for the chapter of faults. One by one, you were expected to stand, prostrate yourself on the floor, and confess your sins from the preceding week. The pressure to confess was immense. Even if you had committed no obvious transgression, you would invent failings, exaggerating a moment of inattention during prayer or a flash of envy for another girl's piety. The silence that followed your whispered confession was a heavy, judgmental thing, broken only by the abbess's pronouncement of your penance. This constant self-scrutiny, this obsessive focus on your own supposed wickedness, was a form of psychological torture. It trained you to be your own jailer, to internalize the voice of the abbess, and police your own thoughts and feelings. Surveillance was constant and total. You were never truly alone. Even in the dormitory at night, a lantern burned at all times, and a supervising nun, the circuiter, would walk the aisles, her soft-soled shoes making no sound, her task to listen for the whispers of conspirators or the sighs of the discontented. This created a profound sense of paranoia, the feeling that you were always being watched, always being judged. The very stones of the convent seemed to have eyes and ears. Can you imagine the unending tension of such a life, where there is no private space, no moment of unguarded repose? Rhetorical questions were often used as a form of instruction and control, a way to force you into complicity with your own subjugation. "Do you not see how your willfulness wounds our Savior?" Sister Agnes would ask, her voice laced with disappointment. "Can you not feel the grace that comes from perfect obedience?" These questions were not invitations to a dialogue. They were traps, designed to elicit only one correct answer, to force you to agree with the logic of your own oppression. It was a masterful, chilling system of mind control, one that left its subjects not just broken in body, but shattered in spirit. Desperation, when it can find no other outlet, will eventually carve a path of its own. After years of enduring the slow, methodical grinding down of your spirit, a spark of the old Alara, the girl who had arrived full of life, flared into existence. It was an act born not of calculated rebellion, but of pure instinctual need, a primal scream against the suffocating silence. It began with a stolen glimpse of the world outside. While cleaning the high windows of the refectory, you saw a family on the road below, a mother, a father, and a little girl, no older than you were when you first arrived, her hair flying freely as she chased a butterfly in a meadow. The image was a physical blow, a vision of a life so normal, so attainable, and yet so utterly beyond your reach. It broke something inside you. That night, you did not sleep. The plan that formed in your mind was simple, foolish, and utterly desperate. You would escape. You had observed the routines, the changing of the watch at the gate, the moment after Compline when the convent descended into its deepest quiet. You saved a crust of bread from supper, a pathetic provision for a journey you could not imagine. Under the sliver of a new moon, you crept from the dormitory, your heart hammering against your ribs with a force that felt loud enough to wake the dead. Each creak of a floorboard, each rustle of your habit, was a thunderclap of terror. You made it to the kitchens, unlatched a small, rarely used door, and slipped out into the convent garden. The night air was shockingly cold, alive with the chirping of crickets and the scent of damp earth, the sounds and smells of freedom. You ran, clumsy in your long habit, towards the outer wall, a dark, looming mass of stone. There was a place you had noted where a trellis for climbing roses reached almost to the top. It was your only chance. Your escape lasted less than an hour. The circuiter, making her silent rounds, had noted your empty bed. The alarm was raised not with a shout, but with the tolling of a single, solemn bell, a sound that cut through the night and chilled you to the bone. They found you at the base of the wall, your hands bloody from the thorns, your body trembling uncontrollably, not from the cold, but from the terrifying, exhilarating taste of a freedom you had only just grasped before it was snatched away. The punishment for an attempted escape, the ultimate act of defiance, was an event of horrific theatrical cruelty. It was not enough to simply discipline you. Your fall had to serve as a visceral and unforgettable lesson for every other girl who might harbor a similar fantasy of freedom. You were dragged back into the chapter house, your face smeared with dirt, your habit torn. The entire community was assembled, their faces a mixture of fear, pity, and a chilling, righteous anger. You were no longer a lost sheep to be gently guided back to the flock. You were a source of corruption, a cancerous cell that had to be violently excised. The abbess herself presided, her voice devoid of all emotion as she pronounced your sin and your sentence. She spoke of your profound ingratitude, of the spiritual treason you had committed against your celestial spouse, Christ. Your punishment was to be the in pace, a name of such grotesque irony that it bordered on the psychotic. You were to be entombed. At the far end of the convent grounds was a small, stone structure, little more than a windowless cell, originally built for hermits seeking extreme isolation. It was here that you were taken. You were stripped of your habit and dressed in a shroud, as if you were already dead. A brief, terrifying ceremony was performed, a funeral mass for a soul still living. You were given a final piece of bread and a bowl of water, and then forced into the dark, cramped space. The sound of the masons bricking up the doorway, stone by stone, was the sound of your world ending. The sliver of light grew smaller and smaller until it was extinguished entirely, plunging you into a darkness that was absolute and eternal. Your screams echoed in the tiny space, but you knew they were useless. Your fate was now sealed. Trapped in the suffocating blackness, with only the sound of your own frantic breathing for company, you were left to contemplate the totality of your defeat. This was the convent's ultimate triumph, the complete and utter annihilation of a human will. Sight, start. It was the tragic, final destination for the helpless victim, your life's narrative arc brought to its inexorable, horrifying conclusion. In the years that followed, the story of the girl who was walled up became a powerful and cautionary legend within the convent, a ghost story used to terrify new novices into submission. But you were not a ghost. You were a living creature entombed in stone, a forgotten footnote in the convent's history. The initial terror, a frantic, screaming madness, eventually gave way to a profound and unnerving quiet. Time ceased to have meaning, marked only by the small portion of bread and water that was passed through a tiny slit near the floor each day. Your mind, starved of all sensory input, began to create its own world. You lived in your memories, replaying them with such intensity that they felt more real than the suffocating darkness around you. But even these began to fade, to warp and distort, until you could no longer be sure what was real and what was a fever dream. You lost your voice from disuse, your limbs grew stiff and weak, and your eyes, accustomed to the total blackness, could no longer bear even the faintest glimmer of light. You were no longer Ilara or even Agnes. You were a creature of the dark, a shell of a human being who had once dreamt of butterflies in a sunlit meadow. You were the system's ultimate success story, a will so completely broken, a spirit so thoroughly extinguished that you ceased to exist as an individual. You became a living monument to the abbess's power, a testament to the convent's ability to absorb and annihilate any force that opposed it. Your suffering was silent, invisible, and absolute, your existence a secret kept by the cold, unforgiving stones of your prison. You were the embodiment of pain after play had ended, a life sentence served in a tomb of unending night. The fate of this one child, a narrative of systematic cruelty and psychological annihilation, was not an isolated anomaly. It was a dark reflection of a broader historical reality that unfolded in countless convents across medieval Europe. The practice of child oblation, the giving of children to monasteries and nunneries, was a socially accepted and often celebrated custom, particularly among the nobility. It was a practical solution for families with too many daughters to provide dowries for, a way to divest themselves of a financial burden while simultaneously acquiring spiritual merit. These children, some as young as 5 or 6, were offered to the church without their consent, their lives irrevocably signed away in a transaction that served the interests of their families and the institutions that received them. While some may have found a genuine calling or a peaceful sanctuary within these walls, the potential for abuse was immense and systemic. The very structure of monastic life, with its emphasis on absolute obedience, the suppression of individuality, and the mortification of the flesh, was a perilous environment for the developing psyche of a child. Stripped of familial love and forced into a rigid, unnatural existence, many suffered in silence, their trauma unrecorded, their voices lost to history. The convent, in these cases, became a place where the spiritual ideals of piety and devotion were twisted into instruments of control and abuse, where the dysfunctional obsessions of those in power could be unleashed upon the most vulnerable. The story of Ilara is a somber philosophical reflection on the immense human cost of these institutions, a reminder that behind the serene facade of faith and order often lay a dark world of profound and silent suffering, a world where the laughter of children was methodically and ruthlessly extinguished,